The plate shattered before Alara Hartwell even realized her hand had let it go. Every head at the long dinner table turned toward her. Candlelight flickered against crystal glasses. Her mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her father's jaw tightened in the way it always did right before he raised his voice. "Clumsy girl," her mother, Constance, hissed under her breath, though loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Pick it up, now." Alara dropped to her knees beside the broken porcelain, her fingers trembling as she gathered the pieces. She did not look up. She had learned long ago that looking up only invited more attention, and attention in the Hartwell household was never a gift. It was a punishment waiting to happen. Across the table, her older sister Beatrice smirked into her wine glass. Her brother Julian did not even glance her way, too busy laughing at something the guest beside him had said. And the guest himself, seated at the head of the table in the place of honor, watched everything with sharp, unreadable eyes. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe of Ravensworth had arrived only an hour earlier, and already the entire household had rearranged itself around his presence like furniture pushed aside for a king. Servants moved faster. Voices grew warmer. Even her father's harsh temper had softened into something almost pleasant, a performance meant only for the Duke's benefit. "Forgive her, Your Grace," Edmund Hartwell said smoothly, waving a hand toward his youngest daughter as if she were an unfortunate stain on an otherwise perfect evening. "She is not accustomed to formal company." "She rarely joins us for dinner at all," Constance added, forcing a light laugh. "We find it easier that way." Alara felt her cheeks burn, but she said nothing. She never said anything. Years of practice had taught her that silence was safer than defending herself, safer than drawing more eyes, safer than giving her family another reason to remind her of her place. She finished collecting the broken porcelain and rose to her feet, intending to slip away toward the kitchen unnoticed. That was how these evenings usually went. She would clean up whatever mess she had caused, however small, and then retreat to the shadows until the guests had gone, and the house returned to its usual quiet cruelty. But tonight was different. "Wait." The single word cut through the room like a blade, and it had not come from her father or her mother. It had come from the Duke. Alara froze, the broken porcelain still cupped in her hands. Slowly, she turned to face him, unsure if she had imagined it. She had not. Duke Ashcombe was looking directly at her, his dark eyes steady and unblinking. He was younger than she had expected, though his reputation suggested a man twice his years. He was known across the region for the way he had rebuilt his family's fortune after his father had nearly destroyed it, for the way he had returned soldiers home from a costly border dispute without losing a single life to reckless decisions, for the way he never spoke unless he had already thought 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Now those calculating eyes were fixed on her. "There is no need to apologize for a broken plate," he said, his voice calm and even. "Accidents happen at every table, even mine." Alara did not know how to respond. No one had ever excused her mistakes so easily, so publicly, without following the kindness with some hidden barb. She glanced toward her mother, who had gone rigid in her seat, her painted smile faltering at the edges. "You are very generous, Your Grace," Constance said quickly. "Alara, thank the Duke and return to your duties." It was a dismissal disguised as an instruction. Alara understood it perfectly. She was meant to vanish again, to become invisible the way she always did whenever something interesting threatened to happen around her. She opened her mouth to obey, the familiar words of gratitude already forming on her tongue, when the Duke spoke again. "Actually," he said, setting down his glass with deliberate slowness, "I would like her to stay." The table went silent. Julian's laughter died in his throat. Beatrice's smirk vanished entirely. Even the servants standing along the walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how Edmund Hartwell would respond to a request from the one man in the region whose favor could restore their family's crumbling finances, or destroy what remained of them. "Your Grace," Edmund said carefully, "surely you would prefer to continue our conversation about the northern trade routes. My daughter has little to offer on such matters." On the contrary, the Duke said, I noticed her watching the map you laid out earlier. Most people in this room have not looked at it once since dinner began. She has looked at it 4 times. Alara's stomach dropped. She had not realized anyone had noticed. The map, spread across the side table near the window, showed the proposed trade routes connecting the Duke's northern estates to the coastal ports. She had studied it out of habit more than curiosity, the way she studied everything in a room when she was too afraid to speak and needed something to occupy her mind besides her own fear. She has a habit of daydreaming, Your Grace, Beatrice offered, her tone sweet but her eyes sharp with warning aimed directly at her younger sister. I would not put much weight on it. Perhaps, the Duke said, or perhaps she was actually reading it. He turned his full attention back to Alara, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was waiting for her to speak, not waiting for her to disappear. Miss Hartwell, he said, what did you see in that map that held your attention? The room felt smaller suddenly, every eye pressing against her skin like a physical weight. She could feel her father's warning glare, her mother's barely contained panic, her siblings' mixture of confusion and irritation. All of it urged her toward the same answer, the only answer that had ever kept her safe. Say nothing, apologize, excuse yourself, disappear. But something in the Duke's steady gaze made her hesitate. He was not looking at her the way her family looked at her, as an inconvenience to be managed or a mistake to be corrected. He was looking at her as though her answer actually mattered. I noticed the route crossing through Millbrook Pass, she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The Duke's brow lifted slightly. Go on. Her father shifted in his seat, and Alara caught the subtle shake of his head, the silent command to stop talking immediately. She had spent her entire life obeying that look. Every instinct told her to swallow her words and retreat into silence where it was safe. Instead, she took a breath. The pass floods every spring, she said. Almost every year without fail. If the new route depends on wagons crossing there reliably, there will be weeks each year when nothing can move through at all. It seemed like a costly weakness to build an entire trade plan around. Silence stretched across the table, thick and heavy. Alara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She had said too much. She had drawn attention to herself in a house where attention had never once led anywhere good. Then the Duke smiled, just slightly, the expression transforming his serious face into something far less guarded. That, he said, is precisely the concern my own surveyors raised 3 days ago. A concern, I might add, that none of the merchants I consulted this evening thought to mention. Edmund Hartwell's face had gone pale, then flushed with something between pride and humiliation, unsure which emotion was safer to display. Constance's hand tightened around her napkin. Beatrice stared at her younger sister as though seeing her for the first time in years. You are well informed for someone who does not join dinner conversations, the Duke said, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. I listen, she said simply, even when I am not speaking. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, a flicker of genuine interest that had nothing to do with politeness or protocol. He studied her for a long moment, as though recalculating something in his mind, before turning back to the rest of the table and resuming the conversation about trade routes as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had happened. Alara remained standing near the broken porcelain, forgotten fragments still resting in her palms, while the conversation moved on around her without her. Yet she noticed, throughout the rest of the meal, that the Duke's eyes returned to her more than once, not with suspicion, not with judgment, with curiosity. It was a feeling so foreign to her that she did not know what to do with it. When dinner finally ended and the guests began retiring to the drawing room, Constance caught her daughter's arm in a grip that was far from gentle, steering her away from the others and into the shadowed hallway beyond the dining room. What has gotten into you? Her mother whispered furiously, her polite mask completely gone now that no important eyes were watching. Speaking out of turn like that, correcting a Duke's own surveyors in front of the entire table. He asked me a question, Alara said, keeping her voice low but steady. "I answered it. You embarrassed your father." "I told the truth." Constance's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Alara feared what might come next. But instead her mother simply released her arm and stepped back, smoothing her skirts with brisk, agitated movements. "You will remain in your room for the rest of the evening," Constance said. "The Duke does not need further distraction from a girl who does not know her place." Alara nodded, not because she agreed, but because arguing would only make things worse. She turned and walked toward the staircase, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor, years of practice making her nearly silent even now. But as she reached the bottom step, she glanced back toward the drawing room, where firelight spilled golden light into the hallway. Through the open doorway, she caught the Duke's gaze one final time. He was not looking at her father. He was not looking at Beatrice, despite her mother's obvious hopes that the evening might end in some arrangement between the Duke and her eldest daughter. He was looking directly at Alara, and in his expression she saw something she had never once seen directed at her in this house. Respect. She climbed the stairs slowly, her mind spinning with the strange, unfamiliar weight of having been truly seen for the first time in her life. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever punishment her father decided to hand down once their guest had departed, one truth had already changed inside her, quietly but completely. She had spoken, and the world had not ended. If anything, it had only just begun. Behind the closed door of her small room at the end of the hall, Alara sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her own hands, still faintly dusted with fragments of broken porcelain. Downstairs, laughter and conversation drifted up through the floorboards, muffled and distant, a world she had never truly been part of. But tonight, for just a few minutes, she had been part of it. And the Duke, a man who owed her family nothing and had every reason to ignore an overlooked daughter kneeling on the floor, had chosen instead to ask for her opinion. She did not yet know what that meant for her future. She did not know that this single moment, this small act of being asked and answering honestly, would set into motion a chain of events that would change everything about the life she had always assumed was fixed and unchangeable. All she knew, as she finally lay down and closed her eyes, was that, for the first time in years, she was not thinking about how to disappear. She was thinking about what she might say next, if given the chance. Morning came too quickly. Alara woke before the sun had fully risen, the habit of a lifetime spent trying to avoid her family's notice. She dressed quietly, tied back her hair without the help of a maid, and made her way down the servants' staircase rather than the main one, hoping to slip into the kitchen and begin her chores before anyone else stirred. She did not make it past the second-floor landing. "You are awake early," came her father's voice, low and controlled in the way that always preceded something unpleasant. Edmund Hartwell stood near the window at the end of the hallway, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, his eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had not slept. "I did not want to be a burden this morning," Alara said carefully. "A burden," Edmund's laugh held no humor. "You have been many things to this family over the years, Alara, but last night you were something new. You were a liability." She said nothing, waiting for whatever punishment he had decided upon during his sleepless night. "The Duke has requested a private audience before he departs," Edmund continued, his voice tightening with something between confusion and irritation. "With you." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shock spreading through her chest. "With me," she repeated. "That is what I said." Edmund's jaw worked as though the sentence itself tasted bitter. "I do not know what game you played last night, but you will not embarrass this family further. You will answer his questions with brevity. You will not offer opinions unless directly asked. And you will remember exactly who you are before you leave that room." "And who am I, father?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, quiet but unmistakably direct. Edmund's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and for a moment Alara feared she had pushed too far. "You are a Hartwell," he said finally. "Nothing more and nothing less, do not forget it." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving her standing alone in the hallway with her heart hammering against her ribs. A private audience with the Duke. She could not begin to imagine what such a conversation would entail, or why a man of his standing would want to speak with her at all beyond the strange moment at dinner. She found him an hour later in the small study at the eastern end of the house, a room rarely used except for storing old ledgers and forgotten furniture. Someone had cleared a space near the window, 2 chairs positioned across from each other, and the Duke stood examining a shelf of dusty books when she entered. "Miss Hartwell," he said, turning to face her. In the morning light, without the formality of the dinner table between them, he looked younger still, though no less composed. "Thank you for meeting with me. My father made it clear I had little choice, Your Grace." A faint smile touched his lips. "Honest even now, I appreciate that more than you might realize." He gestured toward the chairs, and after a moment's hesitation, Alara sat. The Duke remained standing near the window for a moment longer, his gaze distant, as though gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I will be direct with you," he said finally, turning to face her fully. "I did not come to Hartwell Manor merely for dinner and pleasant conversation. I came because I need reliable information about the trade concerns along the northern border, and because your family's estate sits closer to those routes than any other noble house in the region." Alara frowned slightly. "My father has already offered you his assessment of the trade routes." "Your father's assessment mirrors what every merchant in this region has told me," the Duke said. "Optimistic projections, convenient omissions, numbers designed to secure my investment rather than reflect reality. I have heard the same polished speech a dozen times this month alone. And you believe I would tell you something different." "I believe," the Duke said, "that you told me something different last night without being asked twice, and without any personal gain to be had from doing so. That is rarer than you might think among the people I deal with." Alara considered this carefully, aware of the delicate position she now occupied. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. Answer with brevity. "Do not offer opinions unless asked. Remember who you are." But the Duke was asking, directly, plainly, without pretense. "What would you like to know?" she said. Over the next hour, the Duke asked question after question, and Alara found herself answering with a confidence she had never known she possessed. She spoke of the flooding at Millbrook Pass, which she had observed for years from the eastern windows of the manor overlooking the valley below. She spoke of the merchants who traveled through twice yearly, their wagons overloaded, and their complaints about the road conditions overheard during her quiet wanderings through the estate grounds. She spoke of patterns she had noticed without ever intending to study them, simply because watching and listening had become second nature to a girl who was rarely permitted to speak. The Duke listened to every word with complete attention, occasionally asking a follow-up question that revealed just how carefully he was processing everything she told him. He did not interrupt her. He did not dismiss her observations as the daydreams of an inexperienced young woman. He treated her, for the first time in her memory, as someone whose knowledge held genuine value. "How is it," he asked eventually, leaning back slightly in his chair, "that a family with such an obviously capable daughter chooses to keep her hidden away at every gathering?" Alara's throat tightened. She had not expected the conversation to turn toward her family, toward the careful arrangement of silence and invisibility that had defined her entire existence within these walls. "My family believes I am better suited to quiet tasks," she said carefully. "Beatrice is the one meant to charm important guests. Julian is meant to inherit and manage the estate. I am meant to remain useful in smaller ways." "And do you agree with that assessment?" The question hung in the air between them, deceptively simple, yet Alara understood immediately that her answer mattered far more than any observation about trade routes or flooded passes. "I have never been given the chance to disagree," she said finally. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes. "That," he said quietly, "seems like a significant oversight." Before she could respond, the study door opened without warning, and Constance Hartwell swept into the room with the practiced grace of a woman determined to control a situation slipping rapidly from her grasp. "Your Grace," she said, her voice bright and warm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of alarm as they landed on her daughter. "I do apologize for the interruption. I simply wanted to ensure Alara was not taking up too much of your valuable time. She does tend to ramble when given the opportunity." "She has not rambled once," the Duke said evenly. "In fact, I have found this conversation more valuable than most I have had during my entire visit." Constance's smile faltered just slightly before recovering. "How generous of you to say so, Your Grace. Beatrice has prepared refreshments in the drawing room if you would care to join her before your departure. She has been eager to discuss the upcoming Harvest Festival with you." The Duke's expression remained politely neutral, though Alara caught the faintest flicker of something close to reluctance in his eyes. "Of course," he said. "Lead the way." He rose from his chair, and for a moment Alara believed the conversation had simply ended, another brief interruption in a life defined by interruptions and dismissals. But as he passed her chair, he paused and looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I would like to continue our conversation if you are willing. There are matters concerning the northern estates that I believe would benefit greatly from your perspective." Alara glanced toward her mother, whose composed expression had begun to crack at the edges, revealing the tension simmering just beneath the surface. "I would be glad to help however I can, Your Grace," Alara said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how dangerous this moment had become. "Excellent," the Duke said. "I will send word within the week." He left the room with Constance trailing close behind him, already launching into a stream of pleasant chatter about the Harvest Festival and Beatrice's many admirable qualities. Alara remained seated in the study long after they had gone, staring at the space where the Duke had stood, trying to process everything that had just occurred. He wanted to speak with her again, not Beatrice, whose beauty and charm had been carefully cultivated for exactly this purpose, not Julian, the heir whose future would one day depend on alliances just like this one. Her. The realization settled over her slowly, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. For years she had existed in the margins of her own family, a shadow expected to remain silent and unseen. Now, without any effort or intention on her part, she had captured the attention of one of the most powerful men in the region, and that attention had already begun to shift the careful balance of power within her own household. She did not yet understand how dangerous that shift would prove to be. Later that afternoon, after the Duke's carriage had disappeared down the long drive leading away from Hartwell Manor, Alara found herself summoned once again, this time not by her father but by her sister. Beatrice waited in the small sitting room reserved for family conversations, her expression carefully composed into something resembling concern, though Alara had long ago learned to recognize the calculation hiding beneath her sister's pleasant exterior. "Sit," Beatrice said, gesturing toward the chair across from her own. "We need to discuss what happened this morning." Alara sat, bracing herself for whatever confrontation awaited. "The Duke barely spoke 2 words to me during the entire visit," Beatrice continued, her voice tight with barely contained frustration. "Mother had arranged everything perfectly. The seating, the conversation topics, even my dress was chosen specifically to catch his eye, and instead he spent his final hour here locked in a study with you, discussing trade routes and flooded roads." "I did not ask for his attention," Alara said quietly. "Perhaps not," Beatrice said. "But you have it now, whether you asked for it or not, and that creates a problem for all of us." "A problem?" Beatrice leaned forward, her carefully composed expression slipping just enough to reveal the genuine worry beneath it. "Alara, do you understand what is at stake here? Father's debts have grown far worse than either of us realizes. The only reason the Duke agreed to visit at all was the possibility of an alliance between our families, an alliance that was supposed to secure our future. If his interest shifts away from a proper arrangement toward whatever strange fascination he has developed with you, It could ruin everything father has worked to arrange. Alara absorbed this information slowly, pieces of the larger picture beginning to fall into place. She had always known her family's finances were strained, but she had never fully understood the depth of their desperation, nor how much they had staked on securing the Duke's favor through Beatrice. "I never intended to interfere," Alara said. "Intention rarely matters in situations like this," Beatrice said, her voice softening slightly despite the tension still evident in her posture. "What matters is the outcome, and right now, the outcome looks very different from what mother and father had planned." A heavy silence stretched between the sisters, broken only by the distant sound of servants moving through the halls below. Alara studied her sister carefully, searching for the anger she had expected to find, but discovering instead something closer to exhaustion. "What do you want from me?" Alara asked finally. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I want you to be careful," she said. "For your own sake as much as for the family's. The Duke is a powerful man, Alara, and powerful men do not always consider the consequences their attention brings to those beneath them. Whatever happens next, you will need to be prepared for it." It was, Alara realized, the closest thing to genuine sisterly concern Beatrice had ever offered her, buried beneath layers of self-interest and family obligation, but present nonetheless. She nodded slowly, uncertain how to respond to this unfamiliar kindness. "I will be careful," she said. But even as she spoke the words, she understood that careful might no longer be enough. The Duke's attention had already set something into motion, something far larger than a single dinner conversation or an unexpected question about broken porcelain. Whatever came next would demand more from her than caution alone could provide. It would demand courage, the kind she had spent her entire life suppressing in the name of survival. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and the years of enforced silence, Alara found herself wondering, for the first time, whether she was finally ready to find it. The letter arrived 4 days later, carried by a rider in the Duke's livery, who refused to hand it to anyone but Alara herself. She had been in the garden when the commotion reached her, one of the younger servants running across the lawn with wide eyes to fetch her before her mother could intercept the messenger. By the time she reached the front entrance, Constance was already standing on the steps, her hand outstretched toward the rider with an expectant smile frozen on her face. "I will see that it reaches the proper member of the household," Constance said smoothly. "Forgive me, my lady," the rider said, dismounting with practiced ease. His grace was quite specific. "The letter is addressed to Miss Alara Hartwell, and I am instructed to deliver it into her hands alone." Constance's smile did not waver, though Alara caught the subtle tightening around her mother's eyes as she stepped forward to accept the sealed envelope. The wax bore the Duke's crest, pressed cleanly into deep blue wax, and her name was written across the front in a firm, confident hand. "Thank you," Alara said quietly to the rider, who bowed and returned to his horse. Constance waited until the rider had disappeared down the drive before turning to her daughter, her composed expression cracking just enough to reveal the frustration simmering beneath it. "Open it," her mother said. Alara's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal, unfolding the thick paper inside. The handwriting matched the elegant script on the envelope, precise and unhurried. "Miss Hartwell, I find myself in need of counsel regarding the Northern trade negotiations, and I believe your perspective would prove invaluable. I have arranged for a formal invitation to be extended to your family for a gathering at Ravensworth Hall next week, where I hope to continue our earlier conversation in greater depth. I trust this arrangement meets with your family's approval. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe." Alara read the letter twice before looking up at her mother, whose expression had shifted from frustration into something far more calculating. "He wishes to speak with you again," Constance said, though her tone suggested she was working through the implications even as she spoke the words aloud. "At Ravensworth Hall itself." "It appears so," Alara said carefully. Constance was quiet for a long moment, her sharp mind clearly turning over every possible angle this unexpected development might offer. Finally, she reached out and took the letter from her daughter's hands, scanning it once more before folding it neatly and tucking it into the pocket of her dress. "Your father will need to see this immediately," she said, "and we will need to prepare properly this time. If the Duke has taken a genuine interest in your counsel, we cannot afford to waste the opportunity through carelessness." Elara blinked in surprise. She had expected anger, or at the very least continued resistance to the idea that she might hold value beyond what her family had always assumed. Instead, her mother's expression had transformed into something closer to calculation, the sharp gears of ambition turning visibly behind her eyes. "Mother," Elara said slowly, "you seem almost pleased." "Pleased is a strong word," Constance said, though her lips had curved into something resembling a smile. "But an opportunity is an opportunity, Elara, regardless of where it originates. If the Duke values your counsel, then perhaps it is time this family began valuing it as well, at least until it no longer serves our purposes." The honesty of the statement, cold and transactional as it was, struck Elara harder than any cruelty her mother might have delivered instead. She understood in that moment that her newfound value in her family's eyes had nothing to do with genuine recognition of her intelligence or worth. It was purely strategic, a resource to be managed and exploited for as long as it proved useful. But even that realization could not entirely dampen the small flicker of anticipation building in her chest. Ravensworth Hall. Another conversation with the Duke, another chance to speak and be heard, another opportunity to prove that the years of silence had never reflected the truth of who she actually was. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation unlike anything Elara had experienced before. For the first time in her life, dressmakers were summoned specifically for her benefit, though Constance made certain to remind her repeatedly that the gowns were an investment in the family's future rather than a genuine gesture of care. Beatrice, to her credit, offered what guidance she could regarding proper etiquette for formal gatherings, though the tension between the sisters remained palpable beneath the surface of their careful cooperation. Julian, meanwhile, seemed entirely unconcerned with the shifting dynamics within the household, more interested in the financial implications of a stronger alliance with the Duke than in the reasons behind it. He spoke to Elara only once during that week, cornering her briefly in the hallway outside the library. "Do not embarrass us," he said, his tone carrying none of their father's outright hostility but all of his underlying disdain. "Whatever strange favor you have found yourself in, remember that it exists to benefit this family, not yourself." Elara said nothing in response, though the words settled into her chest like stones, heavy and familiar. She had heard variations of this same warning from every member of her family in the days since the Duke's letter arrived. Her value, it seemed, existed only in service to others, never for her own sake. The morning of their departure for Ravensworth Hall arrived cold and bright, the autumn air sharp enough to sting exposed skin. The carriage ride took the better part of a day, winding through hills and valleys Elara had never before traveled beyond the boundaries of her own family's estate. She spent much of the journey staring out the window, watching unfamiliar landscapes pass by, her mind consumed with anticipation and no small amount of anxiety. Ravensworth Hall, when it finally came into view as the carriage crested a final hill, took her breath away entirely. The estate stretched across the valley below like something from a story told to children at bedtime, its stone walls catching the late afternoon light in shades of gold and amber. Gardens surrounded the main house in careful, geometric patterns, and beyond them, she could see the edges of a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. It was, without question, the grandest place she had ever seen, and the sight of it only deepened her growing awareness of exactly how far above her family's own modest circumstances the Duke truly stood. They were greeted at the entrance by a small army of servants, each moving with the practiced efficiency of a household accustomed to hosting important guests. Elara followed her family through the grand entrance hall, her eyes drawn upward toward soaring ceilings decorated with intricate paintings, her footsteps quiet against polished marble floors that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The Duke greeted them personally in the main receiving room, his expression composed and formal in front of the assembled household staff, though Alara caught the brief flicker of warmth in his eyes when his gaze landed on her specifically. "Welcome to Ravensworth Hall," he said, addressing the family as a whole before turning his attention more directly toward Alara. "Miss Hartwell, I trust your journey was comfortable." "It was, Your Grace," she said. "Your estate is remarkable." "I am pleased you think so," he said. "Perhaps once you have settled in, I might show you the grounds myself. There are matters I would like to discuss, if you are willing." Constance stepped forward smoothly before Alara could respond. "Of course she is willing, Your Grace. We are all eager to assist you in whatever way we can." The Duke's expression remained politely neutral, though Alara noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he had not missed the transactional undertone in her mother's response. He inclined his head briefly before turning his attention to the rest of the assembled staff, instructing them to show the family to their rooms and ensure they had everything necessary for their stay. That evening, a formal dinner was arranged in the grand dining hall, far larger and more ornate than anything Alara had ever experienced at her own family's table. Dozens of guests filled the long table, nobles and merchants and dignitaries from across the region, all gathered to discuss matters of trade and politics that Alara had previously only overheard in fragments, never invited to participate directly. Tonight, however, was different. Midway through the meal, as conversation turned toward the ongoing negotiations regarding the northern trade routes, the Duke turned his attention deliberately toward Alara, seated several places down the table beside her mother. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying easily across the conversation, "you mentioned previously that the merchants traveling through Millbrook Pass have voiced significant complaints about the road conditions. I wonder if you might share your observations with our guests here tonight. Several of them represent the merchant guilds most directly affected by these routes." Every eye at the table turned toward her, and for a moment the old fear rose sharp and immediate in her chest, the instinct to shrink away from attention as she had done for her entire life. She caught her mother's expression from the corner of her eye, tight with anxious anticipation, and her father's from further down the table, wary and watchful. But she also caught the Duke's expression, steady and encouraging, waiting patiently for her response without any hint of doubt regarding her ability to answer. She took a breath and began to speak. Over the following 20 minutes, Alara found herself engaged in genuine conversation with some of the most influential merchants and nobles in the region, answering questions about road conditions and seasonal flooding patterns, offering observations she had gathered over years of quiet watching that no one had ever thought to ask her about before. The initial nervousness faded as the conversation deepened, replaced by something closer to confidence as she realized, again and again, that her knowledge held genuine value to the people listening. One merchant, an older man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes, leaned forward with obvious interest as she finished describing the specific sections of road most prone to flooding during spring rains. "How is it," he asked, "that a young woman from a modest estate holds more practical knowledge of these routes than the surveyors we have paid handsomely for the same information?" "I have lived near these roads my entire life," Alara said simply. "I have watched the same patterns repeat year after year. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes not from formal study, but from simple attention paid over time." The merchant nodded slowly, clearly impressed, and the conversation continued to flow around her with an ease she had never before experienced within her own family's presence. Across the table, she noticed her mother watching the exchange with an expression caught somewhere between pride and unease, as though uncertain whether to celebrate her daughter's unexpected success or fear the changes it might bring to their carefully ordered family dynamics. The Duke, meanwhile, watched the entire interaction with quiet satisfaction, occasionally adding his own observations to steer the conversation deeper into territory where Alara's knowledge proved most valuable. It became increasingly clear, as the evening progressed, that this had been his intention from the very beginning, to create a public setting where Alara's abilities could be recognized by people whose opinions carried real weight within the region. By the time dinner concluded and the guests began retiring to the drawing room for after-dinner conversation, Alara felt something she had never experienced before within any social setting. Exhaustion, certainly, from the sustained effort of engaging so directly with so many unfamiliar people. But beneath the exhaustion, something far more powerful had taken root. Pride. Genuine, unfamiliar pride in her own capabilities, uncomplicated by the usual undercurrent of fear that typically accompanied any moment of visibility within her family's presence. As the guests dispersed throughout the grand house, the Duke found a moment to approach her privately, his expression warmer now that the formal demands of the evening had eased. "You handled yourself remarkably well tonight," he said. "I hope the attention did not prove too overwhelming." "It was different than I expected," Alara admitted. "I have spent so long avoiding attention that I forgot what it might feel like to actually welcome it." "A shame," the Duke said quietly, "that such a talent has been kept hidden for so long." "My family has always believed silence was safer for me," Alara said. "Perhaps they were not entirely wrong. Tonight was the first time I have ever felt truly comfortable speaking in front of so many people." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his dark eyes. "Comfort and safety are not always the same thing, Miss Hartwell. Sometimes the safest choice is simply the one that requires the least courage. I suspect you possess far more courage than you have ever been permitted to demonstrate." The words settled into her chest with unexpected weight, resonating with feelings she had never quite managed to articulate on her own. She had always assumed her silence reflected some fundamental weakness within herself, an inability to match her siblings' confidence or charm. But perhaps, she realized now, her silence had never been about weakness at all. It had simply been the only option ever made available to her. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said quietly, "for tonight, for asking." "I suspect," the Duke said, his expression softening into something almost gentle, "that this will not be the last time I ask for your opinion, Miss Hartwell. I find myself increasingly curious what other insights you have kept hidden away all these years." As their conversation drew to a close, and Alara made her way toward the guest chambers prepared for her family's stay, she found herself replaying the evening's events again and again in her mind. The fear that had once defined every social interaction within her life had not vanished entirely, but for the first time, it had been overshadowed by something far stronger. Possibility. The possibility that the life she had always assumed was fixed and unchangeable might, in fact, hold far more room for growth than she had ever dared to imagine. The possibility that her family's narrow definition of her worth had never reflected the truth of who she actually was, or who she might yet become. She did not yet know how much resistance that possibility would face in the days ahead, nor how far her family would go to control the narrative now unfolding around her. But as she settled into the unfamiliar comfort of her guest chamber that night, staring up at the ornate ceiling above her bed, Alara allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future entirely different from the one she had always assumed awaited her. A future where her voice mattered, where her silence was a choice rather than a cage. Outside her window, the moon hung low over the gardens of Ravensworth Hall, casting silver light across grounds she had only begun to explore. Somewhere within that vast, unfamiliar estate, the Duke was likely still awake, perhaps reviewing the evening's conversations, perhaps already planning the questions he intended to ask her next. Whatever came next, Alara understood one thing with absolute certainty as sleep finally began to claim her. She was no longer willing to disappear. Morning at Ravensworth Hall brought a summons Alara had not anticipated. A servant arrived at her chamber door shortly after sunrise, informing her that Duke Ashcombe requested her presence in his private study, before the household began its daily activities. Alara dressed quickly, her mind already turning over the possibilities of what such an early meeting might mean, and made her way through the quiet corridors toward the eastern wing of the house. The Duke's study proved far larger than the small room he had used at Hartwell Manor, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books and maps, a large wooden desk positioned near tall windows overlooking the gardens below. He stood examining a document when she entered, his expression focused and serious. "Miss Hartwell," he said, glancing up, "thank you for coming so early. I apologize for the inconvenience." "Not at all, Your Grace," she said, taking the seat he gestured toward. He set down the document and moved to sit across from her, his expression shifting into something more measured. "I received troubling news overnight," he said. "A group of merchants traveling through Millbrook Pass 3 days ago encountered far worse conditions than anticipated. 2 wagons were lost, along with their cargo. No lives were lost, thankfully, but the financial damage is significant." Alara's stomach tightened. "The flooding you asked about." "Precisely the concern you raised at dinner just a week ago," the Duke confirmed. "It seems your warning proved accurate far sooner than either of us expected." "I am sorry to hear it," Alara said, "though I take no satisfaction in being proven correct under such circumstances." "Nor should you," the Duke said. "But this incident has created an opportunity, uncomfortable as it may be. The merchant guilds are now demanding answers regarding the safety of the proposed trade routes, and several of my advisors have suggested delaying the entire Northern Initiative until a more thorough survey can be conducted." "That seems reasonable," Alara said carefully, unsure why he was sharing such sensitive information with her directly. "It would be reasonable," the Duke agreed, "except that delaying the initiative risks losing the support of 3 merchant families whose patience has already worn thin after years of failed negotiations. I need a solution that addresses the safety concerns without abandoning the project entirely." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of the weight this conversation carried. "I would like your assistance in developing that solution." Alara blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the request. "Your Grace, I am flattered, but I have no formal training in trade negotiations or estate management. Surely your advisors are far better equipped to address such matters." "My advisors have spent the past year offering theoretical solutions based on maps and reports compiled by men who have never once traveled the routes themselves," the Duke said, a hint of frustration creeping into his otherwise controlled voice. "You have spent your entire life observing these same routes firsthand. I trust practical knowledge over theoretical projection, particularly when the stakes involve real lives and real livelihoods." The weight of his confidence in her settled heavily across her shoulders, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. She had spent her entire life being told her observations held no value, that her role within any conversation was to remain silent and let others make the important decisions. Now the most powerful man in the region was asking her, directly and sincerely, to help solve a problem that could shape the futures of countless families dependent on these trade routes. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Over the following hour, the Duke laid out the full scope of the challenge before them. The proposed trade route connected his northern estates to the coastal ports through Millbrook Pass, a journey that, under ideal conditions, could be completed in half the time required by the longer southern route currently in use. But the pass's tendency towards seasonal flooding made it unreliable for at least 8 weeks each year, creating dangerous gaps in supply chains that merchants depended upon for their livelihoods. Alara listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify details she did not fully understand, before finally speaking her own thoughts on the matter. "What if the route was not entirely abandoned but adjusted?" she said slowly, working through the idea as she spoke it aloud. "There is a smaller path along the eastern ridge above the pass, used occasionally by shepherds moving their flocks between pastures. It sits higher than the flood line and would avoid the worst of the seasonal danger entirely." The Duke's brow furrowed with interest. "I am not familiar with this path." It is not well documented, Alara admitted. It has never been considered for anything beyond local shepherd traffic, and it would require some work to widen it sufficiently for merchant wagons. But the terrain itself is stable, and the elevation would keep it above the floodwaters even during the worst spring storms. How confident are you in this assessment? Confident enough that I have watched shepherds use it reliably for as long as I can remember, Alara said. Though I would not claim certainty without a proper survey to confirm the details. The Duke rose from his chair and moved toward the large map spread across his desk, studying the terrain surrounding Millbrook Pass with renewed focus. If such a path exists and proves viable, it could resolve the safety concerns entirely while preserving the shorter route the merchant guilds have been demanding. It would require investment to widen and reinforce the path properly, Alara cautioned. It is not a solution without cost. Every solution carries cost, the Duke said. The question is whether the cost proves worthwhile against the alternative. He turned back toward her, his expression carrying a warmth she had not seen from him before, genuine excitement replacing the earlier tension in his posture. Miss Hartwell, I would like to send a survey team to examine this path immediately. Would you be willing to guide them personally? Your first-hand knowledge of the terrain would prove invaluable in identifying the most viable sections. The request hung in the air between them, carrying implications far beyond a simple survey expedition. Alara understood immediately that agreeing would mean stepping even further into a role no woman in her position had ever occupied, involving herself directly in matters of trade and estate management that were traditionally reserved exclusively for men of standing. She also understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how her family would react to such involvement. My father would likely object, she said carefully. Your father, the Duke said, his tone measured but firm, does not hold authority over decisions made within my household or my business dealings. If you are willing to assist, Miss Hartwell, I would welcome your involvement regardless of any objections he might raise. The directness of his statement, the implicit assurance that her father's opinion carried no weight in this particular matter, sent a strange thrill through her chest. For her entire life, every decision regarding her own actions had ultimately deferred to her father's approval or disapproval. The idea that someone might simply disregard his authority entirely, treating her as a capable adult whose choices belonged to herself alone, felt almost dizzying in its novelty. I am willing, she said finally, if you believe my knowledge would genuinely help. I do, the Duke said. Without question. The survey expedition was arranged for the following morning, a small team of the Duke's engineers and surveyors accompanying Alara along the eastern ridge path she had described. Her family, informed of the arrangement over breakfast, reacted precisely as she had anticipated. Absolutely not, Edmund Hartwell said, setting down his fork with enough force to rattle the surrounding dishes. My daughter will not go traipsing through mountain terrain with a group of unfamiliar men, regardless of whose employ they serve under. Father, the Duke himself has requested my assistance, Alara said, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar tightness gathering in her chest. The Duke has requested many things during this visit that fall well outside proper conduct, Edmund snapped. I will not have my family's reputation tarnished by allowing you to behave in a manner unbecoming of your position. Edmund, Constance interjected, her tone carrying a warning edge that surprised Alara. Perhaps we should consider the benefits such cooperation might offer our families standing with the Duke. Edmund turned toward his wife, clearly caught off guard by her intervention. You cannot possibly be suggesting we permit this. I am suggesting, Constance said carefully, that the Duke has demonstrated remarkable interest in Alara's contributions, interest that could translate into significant advantages for this entire family if properly managed. Refusing his request outright risks damaging the very alliance we have worked so hard to secure. The tension between her parents stretched taut across the breakfast table, each clearly weighing considerations far beyond Alara's actual well-being or preferences. She sat quietly, watching the calculation play out before her, understanding with growing clarity that her value within this family had shifted, but not in the way she had originally hoped. She was no longer entirely invisible, but she remained, fundamentally, a resource to be managed rather than a person whose own wishes carried genuine weight. Eventually, after a tense negotiation conducted almost entirely without her input, her parents reached an agreement. Alara would be permitted to join the survey expedition, provided a chaperone accompanied her at all times, and the family's involvement in facilitating the Duke's business interests was properly acknowledged and, ideally, compensated. It was, Alara reflected as she prepared for the expedition the following morning, a hollow sort of victory. She had gained permission to pursue something that genuinely interested her, something that allowed her to demonstrate real capability and contribute meaningfully to matters of consequence. But that permission had come wrapped entirely in her family's ongoing calculations regarding their own advantage, rather than any genuine recognition of her own worth as an individual deserving of respect and autonomy. Still, as she mounted the horse provided for the expedition and set off alongside the Duke's survey team toward the eastern ridge, Alara found it difficult to dwell too long on her family's motivations. The morning air was crisp and clean, the mountain scenery spreading out before her in breathtaking detail, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was doing something that felt genuinely purposeful. The Duke rode alongside her for much of the journey, occasionally asking questions about specific landmarks or terrain features as they made their way toward the ridge path. His presence, once intimidating in its formality, had gradually shifted into something more comfortable, almost like genuine companionship built through shared purpose rather than social obligation. "You seem different out here," he observed at one point, as they paused to allow the survey team to examine a particularly steep section of the path. "More at ease than I have seen you within the confines of formal gatherings." "I have always felt more comfortable outdoors," Alara admitted. "There is less pretense required. The mountain does not care whether I speak correctly or wear the proper expression. It simply is what it is." The Duke smiled slightly at this, something genuine and unguarded crossing his features. "A refreshing philosophy. I confess I often feel the same, though my position rarely permits such simplicity." "Do you resent it?" Alara asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "The formality, the constant performance required by your position." The Duke considered this for a long moment before answering. "Resent may be too strong a word, but I do find myself grateful for moments like this one, where the performance can be set aside in favor of genuine purpose." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that stretched beyond the formal boundaries of their respective positions. Alara found herself wondering, not for the first time, exactly what this growing connection between them might eventually mean, and whether such wondering was foolish given the vast gulf that separated their circumstances. But as the survey team confirmed, over the following hours, that the Eastern Ridge Path indeed offered a viable alternative route above the flood line, requiring only modest reinforcement to accommodate merchant wagons, Alara allowed herself to focus on the immediate satisfaction of having contributed something genuinely valuable. Whatever complications her growing connection with the Duke might eventually bring, today had proven beyond any doubt that her knowledge and insight held real, tangible worth. As they made their way back toward Ravensworth Hall that evening, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the mountains, the Duke turned to her with an expression of genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Today's discovery may well save countless lives and livelihoods in the years ahead. I do not believe such a solution would have been found without your guidance." "I am glad I could help," Alara said and meant it entirely. But even as satisfaction warmed her chest, a quiet unease had begun to settle alongside it. Her family's reaction to her growing involvement in the Duke's affairs had made clear that this newfound freedom existed only as long as it served their broader interests. She did not yet know how they would react once the immediate benefits of the Duke's favor were secured, nor what price they might eventually demand in exchange for their continued permission. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she understood one truth with growing certainty as Ravensworth Hall came back into view against the darkening sky. She had tasted something today that she could never fully surrender again, regardless of what her family might ultimately demand of her. The simple, powerful experience of being genuinely useful, genuinely capable, and genuinely heard. The celebration dinner held 2 nights later at Ravensworth Hall marked the formal announcement of the Eastern Ridge route, and with it, the beginning of the most difficult period Alara had yet faced within her own family. Word of the successful survey had spread quickly through the merchant guilds, and several representatives had traveled considerable distances to attend the celebration, eager to express their gratitude and secure their positions within the newly viable trade route. The Duke, ever gracious, made a point during his opening remarks of acknowledging the contribution that had made the discovery possible. "I would like to recognize Miss Alara Hartwell," he said, raising his glass toward the table where she sat between her mother and Beatrice, whose knowledge of this region's terrain proved instrumental in identifying a solution that had eluded my own surveyors for months. Without her insight, we would still be searching for answers that were, quite literally, in plain sight all along. Applause rippled around the table, and Alara felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of pride and embarrassment at the sudden public acknowledgement. Beside her, Beatrice offered a tight smile that did not quite reach her eyes, while further down the table, her father's expression remained carefully neutral, though Alara could sense the tension radiating from him even at a distance. The evening continued pleasantly enough, with merchants and nobles alike approaching Alara throughout the meal to offer their thanks, and, increasingly, their curiosity about her other observations regarding the region's terrain and trade patterns. She found herself engaged in genuine, substantive conversations for the first time in her life, treated not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as a valuable source of insight worth cultivating. It was only after the guests had departed, and her family retired to their guest chambers, that the tension simmering beneath the surface of the evening finally erupted. "You will not embarrass this family further," Edmund Hartwell said the moment the door closed behind them, his voice low but sharp with barely controlled fury. "Tonight was the final straw, Alara. The Duke publicly praising you above your own father, above the head of this household, in front of every important merchant in the region. He was simply acknowledging my contribution to the survey," Alara said, though she already sensed the futility of reasoning with her father in his current state. "Your contribution," Edmund repeated, his tone dripping with contempt. "You are not a surveyor, you are not an advisor. You are a young woman who happened to notice a shepherd's path, nothing more, and yet the Duke speaks of you as though you have single-handedly solved matters that have troubled far greater minds than your own." "Edmund," Constance interjected, her voice carrying a warning edge, "perhaps we should discuss this calmly rather than—" "Do not defend her," Edmund snapped, turning his fury toward his wife. "You have encouraged this nonsense from the very beginning, hoping to secure some advantage through the Duke's strange fascination with our youngest daughter. Look where it has led us. Our family's reputation now rests entirely on the whims of a man who seems more interested in Alara's opinions than in any proper alliance with this household." The room fell into tense silence, broken only by the sound of Constance's measured breathing as she visibly worked to maintain her composure. Alara stood near the window, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs, watching the careful balance of power within her family shift and crack under the weight of her father's mounting frustration. "What would you have me do, father?" Alara asked quietly. "Refuse to answer when the Duke asks for my thoughts. Pretend ignorance regarding matters I genuinely understand." "I would have you remember your place," Edmund said, his voice dropping to something colder and more dangerous than his earlier anger. "You are not the head of this family, nor its representative in matters of business and negotiation. That role belongs to me, and I will not have my authority undermined by a daughter who has forgotten herself entirely." "I have not forgotten myself," Alara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice despite the fear churning in her stomach. For the first time in my life, I believe I am finally beginning to understand myself. Edmund's expression darkened further, and for a moment Alara feared she had pushed him too far, that the careful restraint he had maintained throughout her entire life might finally shatter into something far more dangerous. But instead, he simply turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with barely contained anger. "Beatrice," he said, addressing his eldest daughter without turning back around, "you will accompany your sister for the remainder of this visit, and you will ensure she conducts herself appropriately. I will not have this family's future jeopardized by reckless behavior." "Yes, father," Beatrice said quietly, though her eyes met Alara's with an expression that suggested far more complicated feelings than simple obedience. Edmund left the room without another word, and Constance followed shortly after, offering Alara a final glance filled with something that might have been sympathy, or might simply have been continued calculation regarding how best to manage this unexpected complication to their family's plans. Once they had gone, Beatrice moved to sit beside Alara near the window, the tension between them palpable despite the shared solitude. "That was difficult to watch," Beatrice said finally. "I am sorry you had to witness it," Alara said. "I am not the one who should receive your apology," Beatrice said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar softness. "Father has never been fair to you, Alara. I have known this for years, though I confess I never did much to change it." Alara turned to study her sister, surprised by the admission. "Why are you telling me this now?" Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant as she considered her answer. "Because watching you tonight, watching the Duke and his guests treat you with genuine respect and interest, made me realize how much talent has been wasted within this family simply because it was inconvenient to acknowledge it. I do not know if I can change father's mind or mother's calculating nature, but I can at least admit the truth to you directly." "Thank you," Alara said quietly, genuinely moved by the unexpected honesty. "Do not thank me yet," Beatrice said, a hint of her usual wry humor returning to her voice. "I suspect the coming days will prove far more challenging than tonight's confrontation. Father is not a man who accepts defeat easily, and mother's calculations rarely account for anyone's well-being beyond the family's overall advantage." The warning proved prophetic sooner than either sister anticipated. The following morning, before Alara had even finished dressing, Constance arrived at her chamber door with an expression carefully arranged into something resembling maternal concern, though Alara had long since learned to recognize the calculation hiding beneath such expressions. "We need to discuss your future," Constance said without preamble, settling into the chair near the window with the air of a woman prepared for a lengthy negotiation. "What about my future?" Alara asked warily. "The Duke's continued interest in your counsel presents both opportunity and risk," Constance said. "Opportunity, because his favor could secure resources this family desperately needs. Risk, because unmarried attention from a man of his standing, absent any formal arrangement, could damage your reputation irreparably should circumstances change." Alara's stomach tightened with sudden understanding of where this conversation was heading. "You wish to arrange a marriage." "I wish to protect this family's interests," Constance corrected, "which, in this particular circumstance, may well align with securing a proper arrangement between yourself and the Duke, rather than allowing this strange, informal relationship to continue indefinitely without any binding commitment." "The Duke has never suggested any interest in marriage," Alara said, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself recalling the warmth in his expression during their conversations, the genuine respect he had shown her time and again in ways entirely absent from her interactions with any other man in her life. "The Duke has shown remarkable interest in your intellect and capability," Constance said. "It would not be unreasonable to suggest that such interest might eventually deepen into something more formal, particularly if properly encouraged." "You wish me to pursue him," Alara said flatly. "I wish you to consider your circumstances realistically," Constance said, her tone sharpening slightly. "You are 23 years old, Alara, unmarried, with no dowry to speak of given this family's current financial difficulties. The Duke's interest, whatever its true nature, represents the single greatest opportunity you are ever likely to encounter. It would be foolish to waste it through excessive caution or misplaced pride." The bluntness of her mother's assessment struck Alara with unexpected force. She had spent the past week experiencing something entirely new, a growing sense of her own capability and worth built through genuine accomplishment rather than social maneuvering. The idea of reducing that experience to a calculated pursuit of marriage, transforming genuine connection into strategic advantage, felt like a betrayal of everything she had begun to discover about herself. "I will not pursue the Duke for the sake of this family's finances," Alara said firmly. "If something develops between us, it will develop naturally, based on genuine respect and connection, not calculated strategy." Constance's expression tightened with obvious frustration. "You have the luxury of such principles because you have never truly understood the depth of this family's difficulties. Your father's debts grow more severe with each passing month. Without significant intervention, we risk losing the estate entirely within the next 2 years." The revelation landed with staggering weight. Alara had known her family struggled financially, but she had never fully understood the severity of their situation, nor how close they stood to complete ruin. "Why have I never been told this before?" she asked. "Because your father believed such matters were beyond your concern," Constance said. "A belief I am increasingly certain was misguided, given your evident capability in matters far more complex than household finances." Alara sat in stunned silence, processing this new understanding of her family's circumstances alongside the implicit pressure now being placed upon her regarding the Duke. The weight of responsibility settled heavily across her shoulders, the same familiar burden of family expectation that had defined her entire existence, now amplified by genuine desperation rather than simple convenience. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Time is a luxury this family can ill afford," Constance said, rising from her chair with brisk efficiency. "The Duke's interest will not remain indefinitely without direction, Alara. I trust you will consider carefully what is truly at stake before you decide how to proceed." She left the room without waiting for further response, leaving Alara alone with thoughts spinning in increasingly troubled directions. The genuine connection she had begun to feel toward the Duke, the growing confidence in her own capabilities, the pride in contributions that had actually mattered, all of it now felt tangled inextricably with her family's desperate financial circumstances and their explicit expectation that she leverage whatever influence she held for their benefit. She spent much of that day wandering the gardens of Ravensworth Hall alone, working through the complicated tangle of emotions and obligations now weighing upon her. She had spent her entire life being told her silence served the family's best interests. Now she was being told, with equal conviction, that her voice and influence must serve those same interests, regardless of her own genuine feelings or preferences. It was during this solitary walk, as afternoon began sliding toward evening, that she encountered the Duke himself, examining a section of garden wall that had begun showing signs of age and wear. "Miss Hartwell," he said, straightening as she approached, "you seem troubled." "Family matters," she said, unwilling to burden him with the full complexity of her current circumstances. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his expression carrying genuine concern. "Would it help to discuss them, or would you prefer solitude?" Alara hesitated, weighing the wisdom of confiding in him given everything her mother had suggested regarding strategic pursuit and calculated advantage. But something in his steady, patient expression convinced her that honesty, however complicated, remained the safer path forward. "My family faces significant financial difficulty," she said finally, "and they have suggested that your continued interest in my counsel might be leveraged toward a more permanent arrangement between our families." The Duke's expression shifted subtly, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes. "I see," he said quietly. I wanted you to understand, Alara continued, her voice growing steadier as she found her footing within the difficult conversation, that whatever value I have offered you these past weeks was never intended as strategy or manipulation. My observations regarding the trade routes, my assistance with the survey, all of it was offered genuinely, without calculation toward any personal advantage. I never doubted that, the Duke said. It is, in fact, precisely why I have valued your counsel so highly. Genuine insight, offered without ulterior motive, is rarer within my circles than you might imagine. Relief flooded through her at his response, though a lingering uncertainty remained regarding what his words truly meant for whatever connection existed between them. I do not wish for you to feel pressured by my family's expectations, she said. Whatever happens next between us, I would prefer it develop honestly, rather than through calculated strategy on either side. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that seemed to weigh far more than the immediate conversation between them. Miss Hartwell, he said finally, I confess that my interest in you has grown to encompass far more than simple appreciation for your practical knowledge of terrain and trade routes. But I share your preference for honesty over calculated strategy. Whatever develops between us, I would prefer it emerge naturally, free from the pressures your family currently seeks to impose. The admission, quiet and sincere, sent warmth flooding through her chest despite the complicated circumstances surrounding it. For a moment, standing together in the fading afternoon light of the garden, the weight of family expectation and financial desperation felt distant, replaced by something far simpler and more genuine. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding. Thank you, the Duke replied, for your honesty. It is a rarer gift than you might realize, particularly among those who find themselves in your current circumstances. As they continued their walk through the gardens, conversation drifting toward lighter topics, Alara allowed herself a brief reprieve from the mounting pressures surrounding her. But even as she enjoyed the genuine connection building between them, she understood that the difficult conversation with her mother had only delayed an inevitable reckoning, one that would demand far more of her than simple honesty could ultimately resolve. Her family's desperation would not simply disappear because she wished it away. Whatever path she chose moving forward, the weight of their expectations and the genuine consequences of disappointing them would remain firmly present, shadowing every decision yet to come. The Hartwell family's return home marked the beginning of a strange new normal, one where Alara found herself caught between two entirely different versions of her own existence. Within the walls of Hartwell Manor, little had changed. Her father remained distant and disapproving, speaking to her only when absolutely necessary, his resentment simmering beneath a thin veneer of forced civility whenever the subject of the Duke arose. Her mother continued her careful calculations, alternating between warmth and pressure depending on which approach seemed most likely to yield the results she desired. Julian remained largely indifferent, focused entirely on his own concerns regarding the estate's eventual inheritance. But beyond those familiar walls, something entirely different had begun to take shape. The Duke's letters arrived with increasing regularity over the following weeks, each one addressing genuine matters of consequence regarding the Northern Trade Initiative, but increasingly containing personal observations and questions that extended well beyond the boundaries of formal business correspondence. Alara found herself looking forward to these letters with an eagerness she had never experienced regarding any other aspect of her life, each one offering a brief escape from the suffocating expectations that continued to define her existence within her family's household. She had, in the 2 months since returning from Ravensworth Hall, become something of an informal advisor regarding matters concerning the Eastern Ridge route's development. The Duke consulted her regularly on questions of terrain and local knowledge, and she found genuine satisfaction in contributing to a project that would, ultimately, benefit countless families dependent on reliable trade throughout the region. It was during one such consultation, conducted through an exchange of letters spanning several weeks, that the Duke made a request that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everything that followed. I find myself in need of a more permanent solution to our correspondence difficulties, his latest letter read. The distance between our estates makes timely consultation increasingly impractical as the project moves toward its final stages. I would like to propose that you consider a more formal role within my household, one that would allow for direct collaboration rather than the delayed exchange of letters we have relied upon thus far. Alara read the letter 3 times before fully absorbing its implications. A formal role within the Duke's household. Not marriage, not the strategic alliance her mother had been quietly pushing toward for months, but something else entirely. A position built explicitly around her demonstrated capabilities rather than any romantic or familial expectation. She brought the letter immediately to Beatrice, the only member of her family who had shown genuine support for her growing independence over the preceding months. A formal role, Beatrice repeated, reading the letter carefully before handing it back. What do you imagine that might entail? I am not entirely certain, Alara admitted. Perhaps something similar to an advisor, though I have never heard of a woman occupying such a position within any noble household. Perhaps that is precisely why he has proposed it, Beatrice said thoughtfully. The Duke has never struck me as a man overly concerned with convention, particularly when genuine capability is at stake. Alara considered this, a small flutter of excitement building in her chest despite the practical complications such an arrangement would inevitably create. Mother and father would never permit it. Perhaps not, Beatrice agreed. But have you considered, Alara, that their permission may not be entirely necessary? You are 23 years old. The Duke's household exists entirely beyond father's authority. The suggestion hung in the air between them, both sisters understanding the magnitude of what such independence would represent. Alara had spent her entire life deferring to her family's expectations, first through enforced silence, more recently through careful navigation of their calculated interests regarding her relationship with the Duke. The idea of simply stepping beyond their authority entirely, pursuing an opportunity based purely on her own judgment and desires, felt almost impossibly foreign. I need to think carefully about this, Alara said finally. Of course, Beatrice said, but do not think so carefully that you talk yourself out of an opportunity you clearly want, simply because it frightens you. The conversation with her sister lingered in her mind over the following days, as she considered how to respond to the Duke's proposal. She drafted several replies, each one discarded as inadequate to capture the complicated mixture of excitement and apprehension churning within her. It was her father's discovery of the correspondence, several days later, that ultimately forced the issue toward its inevitable confrontation. Alara had made the mistake of leaving the Duke's letter on her desk while attending to other matters within the house, and Edmund Hartwell, conducting one of his periodic inspections of the household's affairs, had discovered it during a routine search through his daughter's chambers. The confrontation that followed proved far more severe than any that had preceded it. You intend to leave this family entirely, Edmund said, his voice cold with barely contained fury as he confronted her in the study, the Duke's letter clutched tightly in his hand. To abandon your responsibilities, your family's honor, in pursuit of some undefined position within a household that holds no legitimate claim over your future. The Duke has offered me genuine opportunity, father, Alara said, working to keep her own voice steady despite the fear churning through her chest. Opportunity I have never once been offered within these walls. Opportunity, Edmund scoffed. You mean scandal, Alara. An unmarried woman residing within a bachelor duke's household, absent any formal arrangement of marriage, will destroy whatever reputation this family has managed to preserve. You will be seen as nothing more than his mistress, regardless of the legitimate work you claim to perform. The accusation struck with painful force, touching upon fears Alara had not fully allowed herself to consider amid her excitement over the Duke's proposal. She had focused entirely on the professional opportunity the arrangement represented, giving little thought to how such an arrangement might be perceived by a society that had never once considered the possibility of a woman occupying a genuine advisory role. "I had not considered that," she admitted quietly. "Of course you had not," Edmund said, his tone softening slightly, though the underlying anger remained evident. "You have been swept up in flattery and false promises, Alara, blinded by a man's attention into believing you occupy some significance beyond what any reasonable observer would recognize as mere infatuation dressed in professional language." "It is not infatuation," Alara said, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself uncertain exactly how to characterize the complicated feelings she held toward the Duke. Respect, certainly. Growing affection, undeniably. But whether those feelings extended into something deeper remained a question she had not yet fully examined. "Whatever it is," Edmund said, "it ends now. You will write to the Duke immediately, declining his proposal, and you will focus your attention instead on securing a proper marriage arrangement befitting your family's position, regardless of how diminished that position has become through this family's financial struggles." "And if I refuse?" Alara asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Edmund's expression darkened further, something dangerous flickering behind his eyes. "Then you will find yourself without a family entirely, Alara. I will not have my household's reputation destroyed by a daughter's reckless pursuit of independence at the expense of everything this family has worked to preserve." The threat hung heavy in the air between them, carrying implications far beyond simple parental disapproval. Alara understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what her father was proposing. Comply, or lose her family entirely, cast out from the only home and security she had ever known, regardless of how limited and stifling that security had proven throughout her life. She did not respond immediately, retreating instead to her chambers to process the weight of the choice now facing her. The following hours passed in a haze of conflicting thoughts and emotions, each consideration pulling her in a different direction entirely. If she declined the Duke's proposal, she would remain within the familiar confines of her family's expectations, safe from scandal, but trapped once again within the same silence and invisibility that had defined her entire existence prior to the Duke's unexpected attention. If she accepted, she risked not only her family's disapproval but genuine damage to her reputation. The very real possibility of being perceived as nothing more than a wealthy man's mistress, regardless of the legitimate contributions she might offer. It was Beatrice who found her that evening, curled in the window seat of her chamber, staring out at the darkening grounds beyond the manor's walls. "Father told me what happened," Beatrice said quietly, settling onto the seat beside her sister. "I am sorry, Alara. I had not anticipated he would react so severely." "He is not entirely wrong," Alara said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "The risk to my reputation is genuine. I cannot simply dismiss his concerns as unfounded cruelty." "No," Beatrice agreed. "But neither can you allow fear of scandal to trap you within a life that offers nothing beyond the silence you have already endured for far too long." Alara turned to study her sister, surprised by the conviction in her voice. "You truly believe I should accept the Duke's proposal?" "I believe," Beatrice said carefully, "that you deserve the opportunity to make that choice for yourself, free from father's threats and mother's calculations. Whatever risk the arrangement carries, it is a risk that belongs to you alone to weigh and decide upon. And if I choose wrongly, then you will have chosen wrongly while exercising genuine agency over your own life," Beatrice said, "rather than allowing others to make that choice for you, as has happened for your entire existence within this household." The words settled deeply within Alara's chest, resonating with truths she had been circling around for weeks without fully articulating them, even to herself. She had spent her entire life allowing others to determine the shape and boundaries of her existence, first through enforced silence, then through calculated manipulation of her newfound value to the family. The Duke's proposal represented something entirely different, an opportunity to determine her own path forward based on her own judgment and desires, regardless of the risks such independence carried. "I need to write to him," she said finally, rising from the window seat with renewed determination. "Not to decline, but to ask questions. I need to understand exactly what this arrangement would entail before I can decide whether the risk proves worthwhile." Beatrice smiled, genuine warmth crossing her features for the first time in longer than Alara could remember. "That sounds like wisdom, rather than reckless impulse. Father cannot fault you for careful consideration, regardless of where that consideration ultimately leads." The letter Alara composed that evening proved among the most difficult she had ever written, carefully balancing genuine interest in the Duke's proposal against practical concerns regarding reputation and propriety that she could not simply dismiss. She described her father's objections honestly, along with her own uncertainty regarding how such an arrangement might be perceived by broader society, while also expressing genuine enthusiasm for the professional opportunity the position represented. The Duke's response arrived within the week, more detailed and thoughtful than any correspondence they had previously exchanged. "Your concerns are entirely valid," he wrote, "and I confess I had not fully considered the reputational risks such an informal arrangement might carry for a woman in your position. I would like to propose an alternative solution, one that addresses both the practical necessity of closer collaboration and the legitimate concerns regarding propriety that your father has raised." Alara's heart quickened as she continued reading, unsure what alternative the Duke might propose that could satisfy both considerations simultaneously. "I propose establishing a formal advisory position within my household, structured similarly to positions held by male advisors within noble estates, complete with appropriate housing arrangements that maintain proper separation and oversight befitting your reputation. Additionally, I would welcome the presence of a chaperone of your choosing, someone whose presence would eliminate any question regarding the propriety of your residence within my household." The proposal, carefully constructed to address exactly the concerns her father had raised, offered a path forward that Alara had not previously considered possible. A formal position, structured with appropriate boundaries, that would allow her to pursue genuine professional opportunity while maintaining the reputation her father valued so highly. She brought the revised proposal to her father immediately, hopeful that its careful attention to propriety might ease his objections. But Edmund's response proved as immovable as before. "A chaperone changes nothing regarding the fundamental impropriety of the arrangement," he said, barely glancing at the letter before setting it aside. "You will still be residing within a bachelor's household, engaged in matters far beyond what any respectable young woman should concern herself with. My answer remains unchanged, Alara. You will decline this proposal, or you will forfeit your place within this family entirely." The ultimatum, delivered with the same cold finality as before, forced Alara toward a decision she could no longer delay indefinitely. She spent that final night within her family's home wrestling with the weight of everything at stake, understanding that whatever choice she made would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her entire life. By morning, she had made her decision. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Alara made her way down to the study where her father typically began his day, reviewing the estate's dwindling accounts. She had not slept, her mind turning over every possible consequence of the decision she had reached during the long, sleepless hours of the night, but her resolve had only strengthened with each passing moment of consideration. Edmund looked up from his ledgers as she entered, his expression already hardening into the familiar disapproval she had come to expect whenever the subject of the Duke arose between them. "I trust you have reconsidered your foolishness," he said, not bothering to set down his pen. "I have considered it very carefully," Alara said, standing straight despite the trembling she felt building beneath her calm exterior. "And I have decided to accept the Duke's proposal." Edmund's pen stilled against the paper, his eyes lifting slowly to meet hers with an intensity that might once have caused her to retreat entirely. "You would choose scandal and a stranger's household over your own family." "I would choose the opportunity to determine my own future," Alara said, "rather than continuing to allow others to determine it for me." "Then you leave me no choice," Edmund said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "You are no longer welcome within this household, Alara. Gather whatever belongings you consider truly your own, and do not expect to return." The words, though anticipated, still struck with the force of a physical blow. Alara had known this outcome remained possible, had even considered it likely given her father's immovable position on the matter. But hearing the actual declaration of banishment still sent a wave of grief crashing through her chest. "Father," she began, uncertain what words might possibly bridge the chasm now opening between them. "You have made your choice," Edmund said, returning his attention to the ledgers before him with deliberate finality. "I will not discuss this further." Alara left the study with tears threatening at the edges of her composure, making her way through the familiar halls of the only home she had ever known with a strange, disorienting mixture of grief and liberation warring within her chest. She found Constance in the drawing room, her mother's expression carrying none of the surprise Alara had expected, suggesting Edmund had already informed her of the impending confrontation. "You have chosen your path," Constance said, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope for your sake that it proves the correct one." "Do you disapprove as well?" Alara asked. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, something complicated passing behind her calculating eyes. "I disapprove of the risk you are taking," she said finally. "But I confess I understand, perhaps better than your father ever could, the desire to escape a life defined entirely by others' expectations rather than one's own genuine desires." The admission, unexpected in its vulnerability, offered Alara a small measure of comfort amid the overwhelming grief of the morning's confrontation. "Thank you, Mother," she said quietly. "Do not thank me," Constance said, straightening with renewed composure. "I have done nothing to earn your gratitude. Simply promise me you will be careful, Alara. Whatever waits for you beyond these walls, the world rarely proves as forgiving toward women who step outside its expectations as we might wish it to be." "I will be careful," Alara promised. Beatrice found her shortly after, helping her gather the modest collection of belongings she considered truly her own, tears streaming freely down both sisters' faces as the weight of their impending separation settled over them. "I will write to you," Beatrice promised, embracing her sister tightly. "Regardless of what Father says, regardless of whatever consequences he threatens, I will not lose contact with you entirely." "Thank you," Alara whispered, holding onto her sister with a desperation born of genuine uncertainty regarding what waited beyond the only life she had ever known. Julian, when she finally encountered him in the main hallway, offered little beyond a curt nod of acknowledgement, his indifference toward her departure carrying its own particular sting, despite her long familiarity with his general disinterest in her affairs. By midday, Alara stood at the edge of the drive leading away from Hartwell Manor, a single trunk containing her modest belongings loaded onto a hired carriage, arranged through a hastily sent message to Ravensworth Hall. She turned back once to look upon the only home she had ever known, its familiar stone walls now representing not safety and security, but the confining silence she had finally chosen to leave behind. The journey to Ravensworth Hall passed in a blur of conflicting emotions, grief over her family's rejection tangled inextricably with anticipation regarding the uncertain future now stretching before her. By the time the estate finally came into view, the same breathtaking sight that had first captured her attention months earlier, exhaustion had settled deeply into her bones, both physical and emotional. The Duke himself greeted her arrival, his expression shifting quickly from welcome to concern as he took in her evident distress. "Miss Hartwell," he said, moving forward to assist her from the carriage, "what has happened?" "My father has cast me out," Alara said, the words feeling strange and heavy as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "I have accepted your proposal, Your Grace, but the cost has proven higher than I anticipated." The Duke's expression darkened with genuine anger on her behalf, though he quickly moderated his reaction, clearly recognizing her fragile state required comfort rather than further conflict. "I am deeply sorry, Alara," he said, using her given name for the first time since they had met. "I had hoped my proposal might be accepted without such severe consequence." "It was my choice to make," Alara said, finding strength in the reminder even as grief continued to churn beneath her composed exterior. "I do not regret it, though I confess the reality of it proves more painful than I anticipated." The Duke arranged for her immediate settlement within a comfortable suite of rooms in the eastern wing of the house, entirely separate from his own private chambers, with a respected widow named Mrs. Alderidge engaged as her chaperone and companion. The arrangement, structured with careful attention to propriety, offered Alara the professional opportunity she had sought while maintaining boundaries that protected her reputation from the very scandal her father had feared. Over the following weeks, Alara settled gradually into her new role within the Duke's household, her days filled with genuine purpose as she contributed directly to the ongoing development of the Eastern Ridge trade route and other matters of estate management, where her practical knowledge proved consistently valuable. The work itself offered a welcome distraction from the grief of her family's rejection, though quiet moments still brought waves of sorrow regarding the relationships she had lost through her decision. Beatrice's letters arrived regularly, offering updates on family affairs along with genuine warmth and support that helped ease the isolation of her new circumstances. Through these letters, Alara learned that her father's anger had not entirely subsided, though the Eastern Ridge route's successful completion and the significant financial benefits it brought to the region had gradually softened his public stance regarding his daughter's unconventional choice. "He will not admit it directly," Beatrice wrote in one particularly detailed letter, "but I have heard him speak of your contribution to the trade route with something approaching pride when discussing it with other landowners. Whatever his private feelings regarding your departure, he cannot deny the genuine value your knowledge has provided to this entire region." Such small indications of softening, however incomplete, offered Alara comfort during the difficult period of adjustment to her new life. She had gained genuine purpose and independence, but the cost of losing her family's immediate presence and approval remained a persistent ache she had not fully anticipated when making her initial decision. It was during this period of adjustment that her relationship with the Duke continued to deepen in ways that extended increasingly beyond their professional collaboration. Their conversations, once focused primarily on matters of trade and estate management, gradually expanded to encompass broader topics, personal histories, hopes and fears each had rarely shared with anyone else. "I confess," the Duke admitted during one such conversation, as they walked together through the gardens during a rare quiet evening, "that my initial interest in your counsel has grown into something I had not fully anticipated when I first extended my proposal." Alara's heart quickened at the admission, though uncertainty regarding the appropriate response kept her silent for a moment, allowing him to continue. "I find myself valuing not only your insight regarding matters of trade," he continued, "but your company itself, your perspective on questions far beyond practical business concerns. I had not expected to find such genuine connection through what began as a professional arrangement." "I feel the same," Alara admitted quietly, the confession carrying its own particular vulnerability given everything she had already sacrificed in pursuit of this new life. "Though I confess uncertainty regarding what such feelings might mean, given the significant difference in our respective positions." "Position matters far less to me than genuine character," the Duke said, turning to face her directly, his expression carrying a sincerity that eliminated any doubt regarding the authenticity of his words. "You have demonstrated intelligence, integrity, and courage throughout our acquaintance that I have rarely encountered among those of far greater social standing. Whatever develops between us, I would prefer it be built upon that genuine foundation, rather than concern for propriety or convention." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building gradually beneath the surface of their professional collaboration for months. Yet even as warmth and hope bloomed within her chest at his words, Alara understood that whatever future might unfold between them would face significant obstacles, both from society's expectations regarding appropriate matches and from the complicated legacy of her family's rejection still shadowing her present circumstances. She did not yet know how those obstacles would ultimately resolve, nor whether the connection building between herself and the Duke could withstand the scrutiny such a significant difference in social standing would inevitably invite. But as they continued their walk through the gardens, the setting sun casting long shadows across the carefully manicured grounds, Alara allowed herself, for the first time since her departure from Hartwell Manor, to imagine a future built not on obligation or family expectation, but on genuine connection freely chosen. Whatever challenges awaited, she understood with growing certainty that she would face them not as the silent, invisible daughter she had once been, but as a woman who had finally claimed her own voice, regardless of the cost that claiming had ultimately demanded. 6 months after her arrival at Ravensworth Hall, Alara stood before a gathering unlike any she had previously experienced, one that would ultimately determine whether the life she had built through courage and sacrifice could withstand the full weight of public scrutiny. The occasion was a regional council meeting, convened to formally review the completed Eastern Ridge trade route and assess proposals for its continued expansion. Representatives from every major noble house and merchant guild within the region had gathered at Ravensworth Hall for the proceedings, filling the grand hall with the kind of influential company that would have been unimaginable for Alara to address just a year earlier. The Duke had insisted she present the technical findings herself, rather than delegating the presentation to one of his official advisors, a decision that had generated considerable murmuring among the more conservative attendees even before the proceedings formally began. "Are you certain this is wise?" she had asked him privately the evening before, genuine nervousness creeping into her voice despite the months of confidence she had built through her ongoing work. Many of these men have never accepted the idea of a woman contributing meaningfully to matters of trade and estate management. Then it is precisely the right time for them to encounter one who does so with such evident skill, the Duke had replied, his confidence in her abilities unwavering despite the social risk such a public presentation carried. Now, standing before the assembled council, Alara drew a steadying breath and began her presentation, walking the gathered representatives through the Eastern Ridge route's development, its economic benefits already evident in the region's improved trade efficiency, and proposals for further expansion that could extend similar benefits to neighboring territories. She spoke with the same clarity and confidence she had developed throughout her months of genuine work, her nervousness gradually fading as she found her footing within the technical details she understood so thoroughly. Questions came from various representatives throughout her presentation, some genuinely curious, others clearly testing whether her knowledge matched the confidence of her delivery. She answered each one directly and thoroughly, drawing on months of hands-on experience with the terrain and trade patterns she had studied since childhood, occasionally deferring to the Duke's engineers on more technical matters of construction, while maintaining clear command over questions regarding practical application and regional impact. By the conclusion of her presentation, the initial skepticism evident among several council members had visibly shifted toward something closer to grudging respect. One particularly influential lord, known throughout the region for his conservative views regarding proper social arrangements, approached her directly following the proceedings. "I confess, Miss Hartwell," he said, his tone carrying genuine surprise, "I arrived today prepared to dismiss whatever contribution you might offer as mere novelty, arranged by the Duke for reasons I assumed had little to do with genuine competence. I find myself reconsidering that assumption entirely." "I appreciate your honesty, my lord," Alara said, "and your willingness to reconsider based on genuine evidence rather than assumption." "Indeed," the lord said, something approaching admiration entering his weathered features. "Perhaps this region has been foolish to overlook such capability simply on account of gender. I shall be curious to see what further contributions you might offer as this project continues to develop. The exchange, along with several similar conversations following the formal proceedings, marked a significant shift in how Ilara's presence within the Duke's household was perceived throughout the broader region. What had begun as scandalous rumor regarding an unmarried woman's unconventional residence within a bachelor's estate had gradually transformed, through the undeniable evidence of her genuine contribution, into growing recognition of her legitimate professional value. That evening, as the gathered representatives enjoyed a formal dinner celebrating the trade route's successful completion, the Duke found a private moment to speak with Ilara away from the main gathering, drawing her toward a quiet balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens below. "You handled today's proceedings remarkably well," he said, genuine pride evident in his expression. "I confess I had expected some resistance from the more conservative members of the council, but your presentation left little room for doubt regarding your genuine expertise." "Thank you for trusting me with the opportunity," Ilara said. "I know the decision to have me present carried risk for your own reputation as well as mine." "A risk I would gladly accept again," the Duke said, "given how thoroughly it has proven worthwhile." He was quiet for a moment, something more serious entering his expression as he studied her carefully in the soft moonlight. "Ilara," he said finally, using her given name with the familiarity that had become natural between them over the preceding months, "I have given considerable thought to our future together, and I believe the time has come to address it directly, rather than allowing it to remain unspoken between us." Her heart quickened at the shift in his tone, anticipation and nervousness warring within her chest as she waited for him to continue. "I have watched you these past months," he continued, "not only contribute genuine value to matters of trade and estate management, but grow into a confidence and strength I suspect you never fully knew you possessed. You have sacrificed enormously to claim that growth, including relationships with your family that I know continue to weigh heavily upon you." "They do," Ilara admitted quietly. "I cannot undo that sacrifice," the Duke said, "nor can I promise that whatever path we choose together will prove free of further difficulty. But I can promise you this: whatever future we build, I intend it to be built upon the same foundation of genuine respect and partnership that has defined our relationship from the very beginning." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Ilara's breath caught as understanding dawned regarding exactly what this conversation was building toward. "Ilara Hartwell," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring simple in its design but unmistakably precious in its craftsmanship. "I am asking not for a strategic alliance, not for the calculated advantage your family once hoped to secure through our connection, but for a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and affection that I believe has grown between us these past months. Will you marry me?" Tears gathered at the edges of her vision as Ilara absorbed the full weight of his proposal, understanding that this moment represented not merely a personal joy, but the culmination of everything she had risked and sacrificed throughout the preceding year. The silence she had once been commanded to maintain, the invisibility she had once accepted as her permanent fate, all of it had led, through courage she had not initially known she possessed, to this moment of genuine choice, freely offered and freely accepted. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." The Duke's expression transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a long moment they simply stood together on the balcony, the celebration continuing obliviously within the hall behind them, while outside, beneath the moonlit sky, two people who had found genuine connection through mutual respect rather than calculated obligation, allowed themselves to fully embrace the future now opening before them. News of the engagement spread quickly through the assembled guests once they returned to the celebration, generating a mixture of genuine congratulations and continued skepticism among the more conservative attendees. But the overall reception proved far warmer than either Ilara or the Duke had anticipated, the months of demonstrated competence and genuine contribution having already shifted public perception significantly in her favor. Word reached Hartwell Manor within days, carried through the same networks of gossip and correspondence that had once made Alara's departure such a source of scandal throughout the region. Beatrice's letter, arriving shortly after, carried news that brought fresh tears to Alara's eyes. "Father has finally spoken of you without anger," Beatrice wrote. "I do not believe he will ever fully admit he was wrong to cast you out, but the announcement of your engagement to the Duke has softened something within him that I had feared might remain permanently hardened. He has even suggested, tentatively, that perhaps a reconciliation might be appropriate given the circumstances." The possibility of reconciliation with her family, however tentative and complicated by pride and stubbornness on both sides, offered Alara a measure of hope she had not allowed herself to fully embrace during the difficult months of separation. She wrote back immediately, expressing genuine willingness to rebuild whatever relationship might still be salvaged, while making clear that any reconciliation would need to be built upon genuine respect for the choices she had made, rather than mere acceptance of the advantageous marriage those choices had ultimately produced. The wedding, when it finally occurred several months later, took place at Ravensworth Hall itself, attended by representatives from across the region who had come to recognize and respect Alara's genuine contribution to matters that extended well beyond simple social convention. Her family attended as well, the reconciliation still fragile but genuine, her father's pride evident despite the complicated pathway that had led them to this moment of celebration. As Alara stood before the assembled guests, exchanging vows with the man who had first asked for her opinion at a dinner table where she had been commanded to remain silent, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened young woman who had once believed her only value lay in remaining invisible had transformed, through courage she had not initially known she possessed, into someone whose voice mattered, whose knowledge and perspective had shaped the future of an entire region. The Duke, now her husband, caught her eye across the small distance separating them during the ceremony, his expression carrying the same warmth and respect that had first drawn her attention during that fateful dinner so many months earlier. "To the future," he whispered, as the ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, built together as genuine partners. "To the future," Alara agreed, her heart full with a happiness she had never dared imagine possible during the long years of enforced silence that had once defined her entire existence. In the years that followed, Alara continued her work alongside her husband, her contributions to matters of trade and estate management, expanding well beyond the initial project that had first brought her into the Duke's orbit. She became known throughout the region not merely as the Duke's wife, but as a genuine partner in the ongoing development and prosperity of their combined territories, her insight and practical knowledge consistently proving invaluable to decisions that shaped countless lives throughout the surrounding countryside. Her relationship with her family, while never entirely free of the complicated history that had once threatened to sever it permanently, gradually rebuilt itself into something genuine and lasting. Beatrice, in particular, became a frequent visitor to Ravensworth Hall, the bond between the sisters strengthened rather than diminished by the trials they had weathered together during Alara's difficult transition toward independence. Her father, though he never fully articulated the regret Alara suspected he genuinely felt regarding his earlier treatment of her, demonstrated his changed perspective through smaller gestures over time, seeking her counsel on matters of estate management with an implicit respect that would have been unimaginable during the years of enforced silence that had once defined their relationship. Looking back on everything that had led her to this life she now inhabited, Alara understood with clarity that the moment of her transformation had not truly been the dinner, where the Duke first asked for her opinion, dramatic and unexpected as that moment had proven. The true transformation had occurred gradually, through countless smaller decisions to speak rather than remain silent, to claim her own judgment rather than defer entirely to others' expectations, to risk genuine consequence in pursuit of a life built on authentic purpose rather than convenient invisibility. The silence her family had once commanded had never reflected her true nature, she realized, but merely the fear that had convinced her, for far too long, that safety required disappearing entirely. It had taken a stranger's simple question, offered without expectation or calculation, to finally reveal the voice that had been waiting, all along, for someone willing to genuinely listen. And once found, that voice had proven impossible to silence again. 3 years into her marriage, Alara faced a challenge unlike anything she had previously encountered, one that would test not only her practical knowledge, but the full measure of authority she had built within the region since becoming the Duchess of Ravensworth. A prolonged drought had struck the northern territories that spring, threatening the water supply feeding both the agricultural lands surrounding Ravensworth Hall and the trade routes she had helped establish years earlier. Reports arrived daily describing wells running dry, crops withering in fields that had once flourished, and growing unrest among tenant farmers who depended entirely on reliable harvests for their survival. Nathaniel, her husband, had been called away to attend urgent matters at the southern border, leaving Alara with full authority to manage the crisis in his absence, a responsibility that would have seemed impossible to imagine during her earliest days at Ravensworth Hall, when her every observation had required careful validation before anyone would consider acting upon it. Now she convened the estate's council herself, drawing upon years of accumulated knowledge regarding the region's terrain and water systems to develop a response before the crisis deepened further. The eastern reservoir has not been utilized to its full capacity since before the drought began, she explained to the assembled advisors, spreading detailed maps across the council table with the same confidence she had once struggled to summon during her very first conversation with the Duke. If we can construct a series of channels connecting it to the affected farmlands, we may be able to sustain the growing season until the rains return. One of the older advisors, a man who had initially resisted her involvement in estate matters years earlier, studied the proposal carefully before nodding his agreement. A sound plan, Your Grace. Though the construction will require significant labor and resources, we may struggle to spare given the current strain on our finances. Then we will need to prioritize carefully, Alara said, and seek assistance from the merchant guilds who have benefited most directly from the trade routes we established years ago. They owe this region a debt of gratitude that I intend to collect. Her decisiveness, once entirely foreign to a woman who had spent her early life avoiding attention at all costs, now defined her approach to leadership within the estate. Over the following weeks, she coordinated the reservoir project personally, traveling to inspect the construction firsthand despite the physical demands such travel required, and negotiating directly with merchant representatives to secure the resources necessary for the project's completion. The work proved exhausting, but Alara found herself sustained by a sense of purpose that had never diminished since those early days of proving her worth at her family's dinner table. She thought often, during the long hours spent reviewing construction plans and negotiating resource allocations, of the frightened young woman who had once believed silence was the only path toward safety. That woman, she reflected, would scarcely recognize the confidence with which she now commanded rooms full of skeptical advisors and merchants, all of whom had learned to trust her judgment through years of demonstrated competence rather than mere title or position. The reservoir project reached completion just as the first signs of relief arrived in the form of early autumn rains, the channels she had designed successfully sustaining enough of the harvest to prevent the widespread famine that had threatened the region only months earlier. When Nathaniel finally returned from the southern border, he found an estate that had weathered genuine crisis not through his direct intervention, but through his wife's capable leadership in his absence. "You managed everything remarkably well," he said, reviewing the detailed reports she had prepared documenting the crisis and its resolution. "I confess I worried, leaving such significant responsibility in anyone's hands during my absence, but I should have trusted your capability more fully." "You did trust it," Alara said, smiling at the memory of his unwavering confidence in her abilities since their very first conversation years earlier. That trust is precisely what allowed me to act decisively when the crisis demanded it. Their partnership, built from the very beginning on genuine mutual respect rather than convenient convention, had only deepened through years of shared challenges and triumphs. Together, they had expanded the reach of Ravensworth's influence throughout the region, always guided by the same principle that had first brought them together, that genuine knowledge and insight mattered more than the arbitrary boundaries society often placed around who was permitted to offer it. Their children, a daughter named Rosalind and a son named Edmund, born several years apart and raised within a household that valued curiosity and honest expression above rigid convention, grew up witnessing firsthand the example their mother had set through her own transformation. Alara made certain from their earliest years that neither child would ever internalize the belief that their voice held less value simply because of expectations imposed by others. "Speak your mind," she told young Rosalind one afternoon, finding her daughter hesitant to offer an opinion during a family discussion regarding the estate's upcoming harvest festival. "Your thoughts matter, regardless of who might prefer you remain quiet." The words, echoing the very lesson Alara herself had learned through such painful and transformative experience years earlier, settled visibly into her daughter's expression, a small flicker of newfound confidence that reminded Alara powerfully of her own journey toward finding her voice. Her relationship with her birth family, meanwhile, had continued to strengthen gradually over the years, the wounds of her father's initial rejection slowly healing through consistent effort on both sides to rebuild what had once seemed irreparably broken. Edmund Hartwell, now considerably older and softened by years of reflection regarding his earlier treatment of his youngest daughter, had become a frequent presence at Ravensworth Hall, his relationship with his grandchildren offering him a second opportunity to demonstrate the warmth and acceptance he had once withheld so severely from Alara herself. "I was wrong," he admitted to her once, during a quiet visit several years after their initial estrangement, his voice carrying genuine humility that would have seemed impossible during the harsh confrontation that had once driven her from their family home. "I believed silence would protect you, Alara, when in truth it only diminished everything you might have offered this world far sooner, had I only recognized your worth as I should have from the very beginning." "You recognize it now," Alara said, offering the forgiveness she had gradually cultivated through years of genuine reflection regarding her own difficult journey. "That recognition matters more to me than any regret over what came before." Looking back across the years that had passed since that fateful dinner where the Duke had first asked for her opinion, breaking through years of enforced silence with a single unexpected question, Alara understood the full significance of the transformation that single moment had ultimately set into motion. She had built a life defined not by the invisibility once demanded of her, but by genuine purpose, partnership, and the confident voice she had discovered, gradually and courageously, buried beneath years of imposed silence. That voice, once found, had never again required someone else's permission to be heard.